Meghan believed one final connection to royal status had survived everything: the departure, the interviews, the broken relationships, and years of distance from palace life. Then Princess Anne made a decision that changed the equation completely. With a signature, a short private briefing, and no ceremonial warning, the last royal designation Meghan had quietly continued to preserve was withdrawn, leaving her stunned by who had ultimately delivered the blow. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Meghan read the notice once, then again. Harry watched her face change before she placed the page flat on the table and said Anne had removed the last distinction she believed the palace had left untouched. The honorary royal designation was a ceremonial label linked to past official service, not a working title that gave her power. But it mattered emotionally, because it was one of the final signs that her years inside the monarchy had not been erased. Harry reacted with anger. He asked why the palace had waited years to settle something it could have addressed when they stepped away from royal duties. Meghan did not answer immediately. She understood that the timing was part of the wound. Anne had been given responsibility for reviewing dormant honors, meaning ceremonial affiliations no longer tied to active service. The Princess Royal had used that authority with precision, and Meghan knew this was not a casual correction buried in paperwork. Anne had prepared for resistance. Weeks earlier, she requested the history of Meghan's designation, including when it was granted, when active use stopped, and every appearance in charitable or ceremonial settings. Her reasoning was simple. Royal distinction should follow continuing service, not survive indefinitely through historical association. When that sentence appeared in the notice, Meghan understood what it meant. The institution was drawing a line between who she had once been inside royal life and who it now recognized outside it. Charles learned about the reaction through a private palace briefing and asked whether his sister intended to reconsider. Anne's answer was immediate: no. She believed leaving the designation untouched would preserve confusion, and confusion weakened the meaning of service itself. The king knew intervening might calm one family wound while reopening an argument about whether royal status could exist without royal duty. Meghan sat with that truth after the first shock faded. The title was gone, but the real question had only begun to surface. Anne had not acted on impulse. Something had convinced her that silence was no longer acceptable, and that buried moment would become the key to everything that followed. Princess Anne made the decision final. She formally removed Meghan's remaining honorary royal designation from the internal royal patronage register, cutting off the last ceremonial connection Meghan had quietly continued to hold after stepping away from working royal life. There was no dramatic public ceremony, no speech, and no chance to soften the meaning. The change was administrative in form, but emotionally, it landed like something far larger. Meghan understood exactly what had disappeared. The Royal Patronage Register was the palace's internal record of which members of the family were officially connected to charitable and ceremonial roles, and an honorary designation was a formal styling attached to one of those positions rather than a title carrying constitutional power. For years, her designation had remained dormant. It had not been actively used by the palace, but it had never been publicly abolished either. That narrow distinction mattered because it allowed one symbolic thread to survive long after her official duties ended. Anne refused to leave that thread hanging any longer. By removing the designation from the register, she ended Meghan's right to use that styling in connection with future ceremonial or charitable appearances. The Princess Royal treated the matter as one of clarity. If the service had ended, then the formal association should end with it. Yet Meghan could not view the move so cleanly. To her, the designation represented proof that the years she had spent inside the institution still carried some recognized place within its structure. The consequence cut deeper because Meghan had never openly fought to preserve the distinction. She had simply assumed that because the palace had left it untouched for so long, it would remain part of her history without becoming another battlefield. Harry understood why that assumption mattered. He knew the designation offered no real power, but he also knew symbols inside the royal family often carried more emotional force than practical authority. Anne knew that too. That was precisely why her decision carried such weight. She was not merely deleting an outdated line from a register. She was closing a space the palace had deliberately left unresolved for years. And once she did, Meghan could no longer tell herself that one formal connection remained protected by silence. The shock was not simply that the title had vanished. The shock was that Anne had decided the ambiguity itself had become unacceptable, and Meghan was about to discover what had convinced her to act. Anne knew this could never be dismissed as routine paperwork. Her involvement changed the meaning of the decision instantly, because she had recently been entrusted with reviewing inactive royal honors and ceremonial affiliations across the family. She was not stepping into someone else's dispute. She had been given direct authority to decide which distinctions still reflected active royal service and which had become empty remnants of the past. Meghan understood why that mattered. An inactive royal honor was a ceremonial distinction that remained recorded even after the official duties attached to it had stopped, while a ceremonial affiliation linked a royal figure to an institution without giving that person political or constitutional power. Anne's new responsibility meant she could examine those old connections and recommend whether they should survive. The power sounded technical. In practice, it allowed her to redraw the boundary between royal history and present royal status. Anne approached that responsibility with the same discipline that had defined her public life for decades. She believed honors should mean something, and that meaning came from service rather than memory. Yet the Princess Royal also knew every name she touched would carry emotional consequences. Removing an outdated affiliation from a forgotten list was one thing. Choosing Meghan's designation as the first highly visible test of the new authority was something else entirely. Meghan immediately recognized the symbolism. She had spent years outside the working monarchy, but the designation had remained one of the few formal links that had never been publicly severed. Anne could have begun with a less controversial case. She could have quietly reviewed minor ceremonial roles that attracted no international attention. Instead, she started with the one name guaranteed to turn an administrative rule into a statement about belonging. That choice made the decision feel personal, even when Anne insisted it was principled. The Princess Royal saw consistency. Meghan saw selection. Both interpretations could exist at the same time, and that was what made the conflict so dangerous. Anne wanted to prove that the new review process applied without fear or favoritism. Meghan could not ignore the fact that proving that principle began with her. The stakes rose immediately. If Anne allowed Meghan's dormant designation to remain untouched, critics inside the palace could accuse her of creating a rule she was unwilling to enforce. If she removed it, the action would be read as a deliberate message about who still belonged within the active royal structure. Anne chose enforcement. And once she did, Meghan began asking the question that would drive the conflict deeper. Why had the Princess Royal decided that her designation had to become the example everyone else would remember? Meghan knew something was wrong before Harry finished asking the question. The formal communication had arrived without warning, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the words on the first page. She read it once. Then she went back to the beginning and read it again, more slowly this time, as if changing the pace might somehow change the meaning. Harry watched her closely. The letter was a formal royal communication, meaning an official written notice, carrying the palace's position rather than a private family message. That distinction mattered because it left little room for misunderstanding. This was not a suggestion, not a warning, and not another unresolved conversation. It was a decision written down in language designed to endure. Meghan kept reading while he waited. Her expression tightened when she reached the sentence confirming that Anne had removed the final honorary distinction, still connected to her former royal role. Harry asked what had happened, but she did not answer immediately. The pause frightened him more than anger would have. Meghan had spent years learning how to respond when royal decisions became public battles. This time, she seemed almost too stunned to fight. Meghan finally placed the letter flat on the table. She told Harry that Anne had taken away the one distinction she believed had been deliberately left untouched: Her voice stayed controlled, but the hurt underneath it was unmistakable. She had never claimed the designation gave her authority. She had never treated it as a path back into official royal duty. Yet its survival had carried a private meaning. One small part of her past had remained formally acknowledged, even after almost everything else changed. Harry reacted immediately. He wanted to know whether there had been a warning, whether Charles had known, and whether anyone had considered speaking to them before making the decision final. Meghan shook her head. She understood that the absence of consultation was part of the message. Anne had not opened a negotiation. The Princess Royal had closed one. Harry reached for the letter, but Meghan kept her hand resting beside it. She told him the hardest part was not losing the distinction itself. It was realizing how certain she had been that nobody would touch it after so many years. That certainty had allowed her to believe one quiet connection to the old life still existed beyond every public dispute. Meghan looked at him and said the sentence that changed the mood completely. Anne had not simply removed a title. She had removed an assumption. And once that assumption disappeared, Harry knew the next question would be unavoidable. Why had his aunt decided that this particular connection had to end now? Harry felt the anger rise before Meghan finished explaining what Anne had done. To him, the decision carried the unmistakable weight of another door being closed by the family. He questioned the timing, the process, and the silence that surrounded it. Meghan listened without interrupting. But when she finally answered, her voice was colder than his anger, because she believed the choice of Anne had been deliberate. Meghan understood what the Princess Royal represented inside the monarchy. Anne had built her reputation around duty in its strictest form, showing up, serving, and expecting very little sympathy for anyone who wanted the privilege without the obligation. That mattered because this was not simply another disagreement with Charles, whose choices could be read through the complicated lens of fatherhood, or William, whose decisions could be interpreted through rivalry and succession. Anne carried a different kind of authority. She was seen as disciplined, unsentimental, and almost impossible to accuse of chasing attention. Harry heard the distinction immediately. He knew Meghan was not saying Anne disliked her. In some ways, that would have been easier. Personal hostility could be challenged. Family resentment could be argued with. But if the Princess Royal genuinely believed Meghan's remaining designation violated her idea of service, then the conflict became far harder to reverse. Anne was not attacking a person in her own mind. She was defending a principle. Meghan felt that realization settle heavily. She had endured criticism from figures whose motives she believed were mixed with emotion, loyalty, or fear about the monarchy's future. Anne was different. The Princess Royal had rarely made herself the center of family drama, which gave the decision a brutal credibility. If she had chosen to act, Meghan feared others inside the palace would treat that choice as evidence that the issue had moved beyond personal grievance. Harry pushed back. He argued that even principles could be applied selectively, and selecting Meghan first sent its own message. She agreed, but without heat. That was precisely what troubled her. Anne could claim consistency while still understanding the symbolism of making this particular designation the first major test of her new authority. Meghan finally told Harry what she believed he had not yet accepted. This was not Charles hesitating as a father. It was not William protecting the future shape of the crown. It was Anne drawing a line and daring the family to say duty no longer mattered. Harry fell quiet at that. Because if Meghan was right, then the real battle was no longer over whether the decision felt cruel. It was over whether anyone inside the monarchy could challenge the one person who believed cruelty and clarity were sometimes the same price. Meghan felt the unease deepen when she realized the decision had not begun that morning. The more she studied the wording, the clearer it became that Anne's move had been prepared quietly, methodically, and without any expectation that Meghan would be invited into the process. This was not a sudden reaction. It was the final step in something that had already been moving behind closed doors for weeks. Meghan traced the timeline carefully. The palace record showed that Anne's review had started well before the formal notice arrived, and that detail changed everything. A palace record was the official internal account of decisions, correspondence, and changes connected to royal duties, and in this case, it revealed when the examination of Meghan's dormant designation had actually begun. She had not been contacted when the file was opened. She had not been asked to explain how she viewed the title. Most importantly, she had never been told that removal was already under active consideration. Harry reacted sharply when he understood the sequence. He wanted to know why Anne had allowed the process to continue in silence if the outcome would affect Meghan so personally. To him, the lack of consultation felt deliberate. If the Princess Royal had truly wanted clarity rather than confrontation, he argued, she could have given Meghan a chance to respond before the decision hardened into something permanent. Anne saw it differently. In the documented review notes, her position was that consultation would have turned a standards decision into a negotiation. She believed the question was not whether Meghan wanted to keep the designation, but whether someone no longer performing the attached royal service should still retain it. Once Anne framed the issue that way, the personal argument almost disappeared from the paperwork. Meghan noticed one sentence that unsettled her more than the rest. The final wording did not mention suspension, reconsideration, or future review. There was no language suggesting the distinction might return if relations improved. Reinstatement had never been contemplated. The message was brutally clear. The palace was not placing the designation on hold. It was closing the door completely. So, Harry went quiet after reading that line. He had been angry at the process, but now he saw the deeper intention. Anne had not merely prepared a removal, she had prepared finality. Meghan understood the danger of that word. Finality meant there had to be a reason strong enough to justify weeks of silence, careful documentation, and a decision written to prevent any path back. And somewhere inside that hidden review, Anne had found exactly what she believed she needed. Meghan stopped at one sentence. The rest of the decision had already hurt, but this line carried something sharper because it reduced years of memory, conflict, service, and identity into a principle that seemed impossible to argue with. She read it again in silence. Royal distinction must follow continuing service, not historical association. Harry saw immediately that those words had landed differently. Meghan understood the phrase before he asked what it meant. Continuing service referred to active work carried out on behalf of the Crown, while historical association meant a connection that existed because someone had once served in that role but no longer did. The distinction sounded almost clinical, yet beneath that careful wording sat an emotional message she could not ignore. The institution was separating who she had once been from who it now recognized her to be. Harry reacted with frustration. He told Meghan that history could not simply be divided from identity because the years they had spent inside royal life had shaped everything that followed. She agreed, but she also saw the trap inside Anne's language. The Princess Royal was not denying that the past happened. She was saying the past could not continue carrying the privileges of the present. Meghan felt the weight of that distinction settle slowly. She had never expected the dormant designation to restore her old position or reopen the door to formal royal duties. But its survival had allowed one quiet idea to remain intact: that leaving the institution had changed her role without entirely changing her place in its story. Anne's sentence broke that illusion with brutal precision. Anne had chosen those words because they created a rule larger than one person. In the documented decision, she framed the matter around service rather than personality, making it harder for Meghan to argue that the removal was simply retaliation. The Princess Royal knew that if royal distinctions followed active duty, then the question became painfully simple. Was Meghan still serving the Crown in the role that created the designation? The answer was no. Meghan knew that simplicity was exactly what made the phrase so difficult to fight. Anger could challenge cruelty, personal grievance could challenge bias, but a principle, especially one wrapped in the language of duty, demanded a different response. Harry looked at her, expecting another burst of frustration. Instead, Meghan grew quieter. She realized Anne had done more than remove a designation. She had redefined the boundary between memory and membership. And that raised the most dangerous question yet. What had happened to convince Anne that leaving those two things connected had become a risk the monarchy could no longer tolerate?